So hello and welcome to another Common Awards webinar in our Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging series. Please welcome our BSL translators, Rachel and Gill, who will be providing BSL translation throughout this evening's proceedings. And please note that this event is being recorded and the video will be available on the Common Awards website in due course. So without further ado, let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Sanjee Perera, a cognitive ecclesiologist whose day job since early this year is as the Archbishop's advisor on minority ethnic Anglican concerns. But today I'm here to ask two of my favorite ecclesiologists and theologians about their most recent collaborative effort. Ruth Harley was a children, youth and families advisor and was working in the third sector before she followed her calling to the Church of England. She's an ordinand at Queen's Foundation who's just about to take up her curacy in the Diocese of Oxford. Reverend Dr. Al Barrett, formerly an astrophysicist, is the rector of Hodge Hill Church in the east of Birmingham since 2010, where he and his church community have been on a long-term intergenerational journey of community building with their friends and neighbors. I first met Al when he was finishing his PhD about 4 or 5 years ago, developing on the thesis, A Radically Receptive Political Theology in the Urban Margins. For those of you who haven't read it yet, has also resulted in a SEM Press book called Interrupting the Church's Flow. And looks like that. So without further ado, let me start with introducing the book. There's so much I can tell you about this book, but let's hear what some real subject experts and theologians and practitioners think of this book. So Professor Anthony Reddy, Director of Regent's College, Oxford, and without doubt the leading light in Black theology of our time, says, "This text, I believe, is an important first in being interrupted. Al Barrett and Ruth Harley have written about what is demonstrably an important and significant text that will command the interest of practitioners, denominational educators, missiologists, and church leaders who will benefit from engaging with a challenging, insightful and hopeful text that encourages us to seek the generous God we serve in the other. Gone is the assumption that the locus of authority lies within the orbit of the church, with God moving from church to those beyond it. Being interrupted challenges us to pause and reverse the flow of the traditional missiological direction, away from the church towards the often powerless others. This requires a massive challenge in identity, focus, and intent. Being interrupted offers important reflective tools for effecting this change, and I, for one, look forward to seeing who is willing to follow this lead." Priest, poet, and theologian Canon Rachel Mann says this about the book. "Being interrupted strikes me as an honest book. Honesty right now seems important. I can't be alone in feeling the trauma, bewilderment, and, well, occasional rage in the face of structures and institutions which no longer seem to be load-bearing, if they ever were. While Al and Ruth rightfully are unafraid to bring sophisticated theological, cultural, and sociological ideas to bear in their interrogation of human economies, ecologies, and ecotones, they keep ever close to the stories. In a world sometimes characterized as post-truth, I understand why some suspect stories a feeble way to frame accountability. Ruth and Al resist this suspicion, and then some. They remind their readers that the promises of mission, which is one way of talking about the promises of God, surely lies in honest, sometimes exhausting wrestling with the power and cost of the human story." And lastly, theologian priest Lynn Cullen says, "Like the child who makes a sandcastle at the edge of the seashore, only to have the tide gradually erode its structures, I was gradually taken back or forward by the ebb and flow of wave upon wave encounter, suggestion and challenge, by the constant gracious beckoning and invitation to think differently, to live differently, to listen and to encounter others and God differently, that Al and Ruth's writing embodies in their own words, by allowing room within ourselves for wild, uncontrollable flourishing. So if you haven't bought the book and read it, please consider doing it. It's such a superb read. And if you have any questions, do use the hashtag being interrupted. So Al, Ruth, let's dive right into some questions. Tell us a little about how you met. How do you know each other?
Ruth, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I think the journey of this book began quite a long time before we met each other, I think probably for each of us, but particularly for Al with his PhD research. But for me, my engagement with Al really came about through online connections and through a blog that Al wrote. And I don't know if you've had that experience where you read something someone's written and you think, yes, they're writing the things I thought but didn't know how to put into words. And that was my experience. And so I wrote a blog in return.
And Ruth's blog picked up on some of the themes that I was exploring in terms of church outside in. And I think Ruth's phrase was church upside down, and focusing in particularly on something that I'd said almost as a kind of off the cuff comment about the place of children within what we now describe together as an economy of being interrupted. And so my initial kind of email request to Ruth was, would you be up for writing a chapter about the interruptions of children? And somewhere down the road, the other end of that, we ended up co-writing a book, which is much more and much richer and much more complex than anything I'd imagined writing myself at that point.
And I think it's worth saying as well that as well as writing together, we do work together. So the book is very much situated in our church in Hodge Hill, the church that we are part of, and the neighbourhood that Al lives in and I am part of in other ways. And that those have been very kind of interlapping and interwoven journeys for us.
So tell me, what was it like to write a book in the middle of a pandemic? Tell us a little bit about the pressures of how you managed to meet that deadline in the middle of a lockdown.
So I think it's probably fair to say, and I have a feeling David Shevington from SEM Press might be lurking somewhere in the background. This book was about a year late. This book was originally supposed to be finished in my sabbatical in summer 2019, which I arrived at, and within a few days in the quiet, reflective surroundings of the community of the Resurrection, Murfield, realised that actually my sabbatical was not going to be the time for finishing, or even, to be honest, starting this book. And so actually it's taken longer than it was supposed to, but actually in the process, of course, in this time exactly last year, the great interruption, as we've called it, of COVID-19 hit. And I think my first response was, oh no, not another, not another reason for not finishing this, not another reason for not being able to make yet another deadline for our publisher. But actually, slowly as we talked through it together, realized that what COVID was doing was forcing all of us to grapple with the question of what it means to be interrupted radically, dramatically, in a way that turns our world inside out and upside down. And that in a way there was no way we could finish a book called Being Interrupted without pulling it through this particular global experience. So it was a challenge, but it was also in some strange way a gift.
Yeah, definitely. It's writing a book with the title Being Interrupted is a bit of a hostage to fortune, in that every time anything interrupts us now, somebody goes, well, being interrupted. And that obviously was a challenge. And yes, having to say, well, that book we were writing called Being Interrupted, well, we've been interrupted. But actually, I think we learned a huge amount about not only about being interrupted, but also writing in an interrupted circumstance and in interrupted ways. So huge amounts of, particularly the last few chapters, were written whilst Al had children at home from school, and I wrote a lot of mine at the kitchen table. We had a lot of burnt dinners in our house during the last few weeks of that. But suddenly the boundaries between life and ministry and writing and academia and church and neighbourhood were really interrupted in ways that I think ultimately have enriched the writing process and hopefully what has emerged from it.
So tell me, did you develop any pet peeves in this collaboration? And Ruth, I'm going to ask you to start this off. It must be really difficult to be working with your boss and writing a book with your boss. How did that work out?
To be honest, I know you wanted to ask about pet peeves, but I haven't really got any to share. I think instead I'm going to share something about one of the sort of the ways that writing together and working together at the same time have kind of really overlapped and sort of interlocked in really, really helpful ways. Partly because I think it means that we know each other beyond the written page, but partly also because what we're doing and what we're writing about and the way we're writing it have all kind of aligned together. So one of our great phrases as we've written this, the most frequent phrase either of us have used, is yes, and. So it feels like a sort of constant picking up the ball or baton or whatever metaphor you want to use and running with it, and then kind of throwing it to each other and carrying on. There's always a yes and there's always another yes and I think one of the hardest things is recognizing that there will always be more yes ands, and at some point we just have to stop.
What about you, Al?
And likewise, I'm not going to answer your question, Sanjee, not directly anyway, and possibly just pick a little hole in it, in that I'm not sure in any sense have I been Ruth's boss at any point over the past 3 years. And while one of the things that we try and do in our writing and in our book is face squarely on questions of power and privilege, and within that kind of structures of power and privilege and authority within the church, actually one of the gifts for me in all of this has been Ruth coming to Hodghill Church with fresh eyes, coming as an outsider to the story that I had lived here for a good 8 years before Ruth arrived with us as an ordinand, and actually that's a gift that I've experienced, both as being able to ask those critical questions of why do you do it like that, but also actually the gift of encouragement and affirmation that she's been able to see some of the things that in the way we do things in Hodghill have been embedded and actually I take for granted, that Ruth's come as an outsider and said, do you know what, not all churches do it like that, and actually what you've got there is something that might be worth sharing with the wider world. And I think one of the things that for both of us, I guess increasingly as Ruth's become assimilated into Hodghill in many ways, we've had to be reminded that a lot of what we describe is maybe interesting to other people, because it, in many ways it just describes what we live and breathe in the way we do things locally.
It's interesting you should say that. So I remember that last autumn Ruth was saying, I asked this question from Ruth, I don't know whether you remember, Ruth, what's it like writing with Al, or what was it like writing with Al? And I remember Ruth saying, it's really interesting. He's always very aware of the privilege and powers that come with being a white male, and he's constantly self-examining that. And I found that really interesting as a part of a collaborative, academic collaborative process. So, okay. Let's move on to some of your theological differences. Then, was there any, or do you come very much from the same neck of the woods in theological differences? Was there any alterity in your in your approach to this particular ecclesiological diagnosis?
That's a really good question. One of the things about developing a shared writing voice is that you don't lose sight of where you differ about things, but you sort of don't focus on those bits. And I think one of the things that I love the bit that you read earlier about this being an honest book, and I think one of the things that collaboration encourages is being really honest first with each other, and then that must show through in the way that we write. And I think one of the things it's made us both really aware of is our own kind of particularity and situatedness, and that our life experiences and our position in the world are not the same. In some respects, they're very similar, and in other respects, they're really quite different. And so needing to do that constant checking in of this is how it is for me, but is that how it is for you? So just a sort of throwaway example is when we were writing one of the chapters, and Al sent me a draft over with a little query. Among the queries was, I've claimed here that when both of us were growing up, people wore those colourful WWJD wristbands, but is that true for you? And it was true for me, and so there it is in the book. But there are all sorts of much bigger questions where we have asked each other, is that true for you? And there are places in the book where we've had to sort of lose that collective voice in order to say, this is what is true for me, and this is what is true for you. And I think that's been quite an interesting process of working out where those places are.
And I think, just to add to that, one of the things that we've tried to do really carefully in the book, and invite other people to do as they read it, is interrogate the use of the word we and us and church, to acknowledge that actually one of the things that power and privilege does so often is project a we out of a particular experience and claim for it more than that particularity. And so I think actually, as Ruth's described, that exercise of interrogating that we, that us between us, has been really helpful in clarifying our writing, but also I think in continuing to shape our own identities. And I think, one of the things that we've touched on in the book, and I think have continued learning since, is both our locatedness differently, but also the sense that locatedness is not fixed, that it continues to change, and actually has continued to change through our interaction with each other, through our engagements with the world, as the world has changed as we've written the book, and in so many other ways as well.
So I'm going to come back to that locatedness in a minute, but before we do, Ruth and Al, will you give me a one-sentence summary of what you think the book is about, for those, especially for those of the audience that might not have yet read the book?
Gosh, one sentence is actually quite difficult.
I will give you 3 sentences.
I think it's, for me, the book is about exploring in a context of fault lines of race, class, gender, and other fault lines, and in the context of an institutionally anxious church, exploring what the possibilities are for the church. I think that's the thing I want to emphasize, is we're not saying here's an answer. We're saying here are some openings, some possibilities, some ways forward, some ways into the conversation. And foremost among those is this idea of being radically receptive to meeting God in our neighbours and in our neighbourhoods and discovering God's kingdom there.
What about you, Al?
I think Ruth's done most of the hard work on this already, but I guess one of the things that we want to do in the process of reading the book is journey through a journey on a Christological journey to actually reflect more sharply and more deeply on where we locate Jesus in our imaginations, in terms of the way we relate to our neighbours, and the way we live out our Christian faith and the way we do church and mission. And hopefully on that journey, and particularly through engagements in what we might call a kind of subtext or a submerged narrative in Mark's gospel, actually open up the idea both that Jesus might be someone we identify with, but also someone who we identify with our others and encounter in our others, and both as someone who is active and takes the initiative, but also as someone who himself is interrupted and disrupted and challenged and changed in the process. And I think we don't do it directly a lot of the time, but I think that invites us into all kinds of deeper questions around what kind of God we're dealing with.
Now, you were talking about locatedness earlier. So if you were reading, the book is very, very clearly located in your particular parish, in a particular socio-demography, and then reaches out. But if you were reading this book, from the Chinese context or the Nigerian context or the Sri Lankan context, do you think that we'd read the book in the same way? So you draw scriptural ecclesiology that projects a sort of an abstract universalism, but how do you think it will be perceived, or how does it relate to those very different contexts? What do they have to gather from your book?
I think that's a hard question for us to answer in some ways, because the necessarily limited nature of our engagements from day to day that have shaped the writing of this mean that we've not attempted to be that ambitious in a way. We've written very consciously out of what we know, what we live. And that means that, as you say, Sanjee, it's quite a Church of England-y book, as well as quite an English book, as well as written by two people who are very much insiders to the church institution, however edgy we might sometimes imagine ourselves to be. But I guess the hope that I would have would be that the way we've written it, placing encounter and conversation and openness to the gifts and challenges of those who are other than us, might invite touching places, bumping spaces, as we call them, for those who read it from a very different experience, and might invite the possibility of conversation in spaces and with people that are beyond the horizon that we've set it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that conversational thing is really key for me. So one of the ways that we kind of imagine the book is as a point in a conversation. So it's not emerged out of nowhere and it's not going into nothing. It's a point in an ongoing conversation. It's emerged out of conversations that we've had with each other, with our neighbours, with all sorts of theological and other conversation partners. And we hope it will generate further conversation in all sorts of contexts. And I guess, as with any kind of conversation, you can't prompt or preempt what the response is going to be when you speak in a conversation, can you? You speak and then you listen, and that kind of shapes where you go next. And I think that, for me, is really key. So we've been really, really encouraged by hearing about people reading the book in groups and in contexts very different to ours. And I think that for me is where it might have some life beyond contexts that look like ours, is in people reading it together and working out how it touches on or bumps into their journeys in their contexts.
And I think with that, it's probably worth saying that even among the 5 dimensions of privilege that we explore in the book, Ruth and I wrestled with the question of actually, do we engage through the lenses of sexuality and disability as well, for example, and had to reluctantly say, not for this book and not for this bit of the conversation. But what's been wonderful since publication is that we've found ourselves in conversations with people who have approached it and read it through those lenses and have found resonances and have brought new resources and new challenges to the conversation by reading it through those lenses.
Yeah, it's back to the yes ands again, isn't it? You know, we have offered a lot of yes and to each other and hopefully to our readers. But now we are being offered back more yes ands, and that's been a really encouraging part of the journey.
I'm really interested in this concept of the fault lines you explore. Can you tell me a little bit about your locatedness in those fault lines, especially in terms of race and class and sexuality and disability? Where does that fit into your locatedness?
Sure. Shall I go first, Al? Or do you want to? Yeah. So I would locate myself in various ways. So the key fault lines that we pick up in the book are race, class, gender, age, so adults and children. We're primarily thinking about there, and also the relationships between humans and our non-human neighbours. So obviously I am a human. So that's where I'm related there, which comes with a degree of privilege that I think we often overlook in our conversations about how we relate to our non-human neighbours. And I am an adult, and that also comes with a huge degree of power and privilege in the way that I relate to my neighbours who are not adults. And I'm white, so that comes with a massive amount of privilege, which I hope we're going to go on and unpack a bit more about that. And one of the things we've been really conscious of in writing this book is that we are both white, and the need to be really attentive to our conversation partners who have a different experience of the world through the lens of race. But in other dimensions that we explore, I am less privileged. So I'm a woman, and I come from a working class background, although I'm now extremely well educated. So, you know, that's sometimes a less clear-cut distinction. So I think what I would want to say is that I sit, as most of us do, in a kind of complex, overlapping, intersecting web of privileges and marginalizations and experience and all those kinds of things. And yeah, it's complicated. Ow.
And as is probably fairly obvious, the dimensions of privilege that Ruth has ticked off, I can also tick off, but also add being male. And in terms of my own background, inescapably middle class from birth as well. And I think one of the drivers for me behind trying to wrestle with the stuff that we've ended up writing in this book has been that when I trained for ordained ministry at Queen's 20 years ago, I discovered feminist theology, Black theology, liberation theology through a lens of class, and was hugely excited about hearing those voices articulate theology which challenged the status quo from positions of social, cultural, theological marginalization. And slowly over the years have had to ask myself, but how do I articulate a theology that challenges the status quo while acknowledging that I am not in one of those marginalized groups? How do I articulate a liberationist theology whilst acknowledging that I am part of the problem, that I am part of those systems, that I have those multiple layers of privilege? And if I'm honest, there has not been a huge amount of published theology out there that has enabled me to do that work. And so that certainly for me was one of the real drivers behind trying to articulate this. It's a project with firm commitments to feminist theology, firm commitments to Black theology, for example, but we can't be Black theologians. We are white, and so we need to find ways of articulating our own locatedness within those imbalances of power and those struggles.
Can I ask you, so when I read your work, both Being Interrupted, but also the previous book, Interrupting the Church's Flow, one of the things that struck me was that your definitions of whiteness as white theologians, for want of a better word, really resonated with me. Will you give, we are very aware of the various Black theological definitions of whiteness. From your particular vantage, will you give us a definition of whiteness at this point?
It didn't make it into the book because it was a book that came out very recently, but Willie Jennings' After Whiteness I've found hugely helpful in kind of narrowing this into a definition that's really helpful. So Willie Jennings talks about whiteness as not referring to people of European descent, but to a way of being in the world and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habitation and its meaning making. And I think, there's something profoundly helpful in that sense that, of course, it is performed by people whose skin color is pale. And of course, it privileges in so many ways people whose skin color is pale, but actually is something that is far more systemic. And in the process, one of the things that gives whiteness power is precisely depending on its own invisibility. For so much of the time, it's the air that we breathe that those of us who are white manage to not notice.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. And I'd want to build on that by drawing on the work of Peggy McIntosh, who is a white theologian, who talks about the invisibility of whiteness and about whiteness being something that white people are meant to remain oblivious to. It's something that we are brought up and enculturated not to notice. And that is how it retains its power. And Peggy McIntosh describes it as white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions. And I think that's such a powerful image that it's something that I can remain oblivious to if I choose to, which is not a luxury that my friends and brothers and sisters of colour have. But that it is still something, however oblivious I am to it, which confers huge benefits on me. And the other thing I think I'd want to throw in that Peggy McIntosh offers is the idea that describing whiteness and describing white privilege is in itself a really important theological task, because she says that describing it makes us accountable. It's this idea that once you know, you can't unknow. And I think that's a really powerful and helpful beginning to resisting that kind of system of thinking.
I think one of the things that we try and narrate in the book, particularly by setting it at the beginning in the kind of historical context of a few moments and movements and events, particularly in British society, and we name the Windrush scandal and Grenfell Tower as two of those. is that for those of us that have that privilege to be oblivious, there are moments that interrupt us and surprise us. And that surprise can often turn into shock that can kind of create a wedge in our worldview that enables us to learn new things. And as Ruth said, to see things that we then can't unsee. But at the same time, to be reminded that for so many, many people, those events don't come as a surprise at all. They are the lived reality year after year of life from birth onwards. And that even that is one of the differences that is hugely powerful.
So, Ruth, tell me, where does your book belong on a bookshelf in the library? I have very strong views on where it belongs. Some people might say it's ecclesiology. Some people might put it in their Christocentric section. Some people might see it as eschatology. Where would you put? Where does your book fit in?
I think one answer is that we're awkward. And I feel sorry for librarians that have to make these decisions. And I guess, quite deliberately, the book sits at intersections. So it sits at intersections between different kind of structural privileges and marginalizations, but also, as you say, Sanjee, kind of sits at the intersection between ecclesiology and missiology. We want to say that you can't do ecclesiology without imagining, without acknowledging the ways in which church is formed in our interactions beyond church. I guess practical theology, we would both own as the discipline that we're working in. It is fundamentally rooted in context and practice and experience, and engages with the theological tradition quite explicitly from that point. But yeah, in many ways, I think we're quite deliberately awkward.
Yeah, we are pretty deliberately awkward. But I think, I don't know, I think if I had to pick, I would probably shelve it with missiology, although I think that the risk there is that by overemphasizing the missiological implications, we might be downplaying some of the other aspects of it. But you've got to put it somewhere, haven't you? You've just got to put it on a shelf. So I think that's the one I'd pick.
How appropriate for a book that popularizes the concept of ecotones. So, okay, tell us a little bit about the forebearers of the book. Who enriched this book? Who did you read in formulating your ideas?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think for me, I came to this book on quite a long journey. So some authors are quite recent, but some go a long way back. In terms of church engaging with neighborhoods, Anne Morrissey has been a profoundly significant influence on me, beyond the Good Samaritan and Journeying Out, amongst others. I've mentioned liberation theology already, both from Latin America, but also efforts towards liberation theology in this country, primarily from middle-class theologians reflecting, like John Vincent, Ken Leach, and Chris Shanahan, for example. But actually a sense that there was a gap there that needed to be worked on. In terms of Black theology, Anthony Reddy has been a huge influence on me, all the way from Is God Colorblind through to Theologizing Brexit. And then more recently, some critical white theology from the States, so Jim Perkinson and Jennifer Harvey, amongst others. I should really stop and give Ruth a chance to get in as well, but I want to name, particularly in feminist theology, Nicholas Slee I've journeyed with a long time, both as a theologian whose work I've read, but also as a friend and travelling companion along the way. Nicola was one of my tutors at Queen's 20 years ago. And so Nicola's work, but also that of Melissa Raphael and Rita Nakashima Brock, amongst others, for me have raised all kinds of challenging questions around Christology, ecclesiology and missiology from a feminist perspective. There's loads more.
Yeah, there's tons. One of the things people say to us a lot about this is, "Oh, it's quite an eclectic mix you've got in there, isn't it?" And there is. I mean, partly I think this is both of our way of reading, which is quite broad. All of those that Al has just said, I would want to echo. I would want to as well give a particular mention to Shelley Rambo, who's thinking about Holy Saturday space in her amazing work is just really has been really key to shaping how we think about being interrupted in the context of crucifixion and resurrection. But I think what I also wanted to reflect on was that I was asked a fantastic question recently by Alison Erie on her wonderful podcast Recovering God, and she said, "There's a lot of the theologians you refer to are women, and a lot of the theologians you refer to are people of colour. Was that a deliberate choice?" And I thought, what a great question. I'd not thought about it before, really. And it's not as if we sat there and went, "Oh, we must make sure we have plenty of women and people of colour in this book." It's more that for both of us, we've cultivated over a long period of time a habit of reading diverse theologians and reading theologians who are writing from positions of marginalisation of various sorts. And therefore, when we reach for somebody who says something about a topic we want to think about, they are likely to be a more diverse range of thinkers. So I think, yeah, that kind of cultivation of a broad range of conversation partners has been really important to both of us, I think.
So can I throw some really unlikely conversation partners at you? I asked this question on Twitter, and I asked people to share images of the books you might read in tandem with. And I read this with while rereading Scruton and Michael Delanoy. How does the book respond to spaces like that? Institutional descriptions of the Church of England from a particular culture. And will you tell us a little bit about what you mean in this context of how the idea that the Church of England is institutionally anxious? As somebody who works with the church, I'd particularly want to know what you mean by that.
I think it's fair to say that we've not spent much of our time and energy engaging with multiply privileged people who want to shore up a certain form of the established church. That's not really our ball game. But yeah, that sense that we've described the Church of England particularly, but probably other churches, as institutionally anxious. We describe in the book what we call two economies that profoundly shape our imaginations, the way we think and make decisions, what we invest money and time and energy in. One of those economies we call the economy of counting in, where what is valued most are things that you can count, and things primarily that come into church, namely attendees and money. And the second economy we call the economy of giving out, where rather than seeing a lack at the heart of the church institution that needs to be filled, we perceive a lack in our wider neighbourhoods that needs to be filled with what the church believes it has to offer. And I think both of those we would want to identify as powerful driving forces of the way the Church of England is operating today. And both of those, I think, have been exposed and intensified by the COVID pandemic, even more so than perhaps they were already. And I think one of the things that we try and do in the book is say there is at least possibly a third economy which doesn't have a lack at its heart, but actually is rooted in an abundance to be discovered in our neighborhoods and in our neighbors, both human and non-human. And actually, that's much harder to strategize, and we don't attempt to strategize it. And actually, within that third economy, we want to speak of death and decay and decomposition, as well as resurrection. But actually, we hear in that abundance, or we see in that abundance, an invitation to let go of those anxieties. And that's an ambivalent thing for someone like me to say, who is dependent on the church to pay my livelihood at this point in time. But actually, we have to acknowledge that those kind of dependencies are part of that system of anxiety, rather than necessarily a theological truth.
Yeah. And I think the big questions underlying this stuff about institutional anxiety are those questions around, do we primarily perceive lack, or do we primarily perceive abundance when we think about church? And therefore, when we think about God, these are actually questions about who God is for us. And again, the other big question that's underlying that, I think, is a question about control, and about, Al mentioned strategizing, and strategizing, I think, is often a response to feeling out of control, and wanting to reassert control. And I think we often see the church acting out of anxiety in ways that are about wanting to assert control, wanting to have a strategy for growth, or a strategy for mission, or whatever it is, as a way of saying, yep, we've got it, we're in control, it's all right. But actually, isn't it possible that what God is inviting us into is a letting go, and that actually the work of a lifetime of faith is the work of letting go? And letting go, not letting go of control, letting go of the illusion of control. I think that profound sense of ourselves as creatures, as created, and as dependent on God and interdependent on our human and non-human neighbours. Grasping that is, for me, at the heart of letting go of that need for control and that institutional anxiety that comes with it.
And I think if I could maybe just add to that very briefly, that's not the same as doing nothing. And one of the things that we're wanting to say in the book, and that we recognize in the stories of Jesus encounters that we explore in the middle, it's not about passivity. What we describe in some places as radical receptivity is often an immensely proactive approach to our interactions with our neighbours. It's about seeking out spaces of encounter. It's about nurturing spaces where voices can be heard to speech. It's about doing the work on ourselves in response to what we hear and the gifts and the challenges that we've received. It's about challenging those who are who have similar privileges to us to do the work that we're trying to do ourselves. You know, all of that is immensely active stuff. And you know, just in response very briefly to another comment in the Q&A, that stuff has got to look towards the structures, the power structures as well. You know, it's not just at the level of personal power and privilege that we're talking. Actually, we talk towards the end of the book about what would the Roman centurion at the cross do the next day after he's acknowledged that Jesus, rather than Caesar, is the Son of God. And we begin to explore ways of betraying the systems, of letting down the structures that maybe have supported us and have enabled us to be oblivious up until those points of being interrupted.
So we spent a lot of time looking at the church and looking at the missiology of your book. But let's go back to the theology, and particularly to your Trinitarian theology and perhaps your Christocentric nuances. Can you tell us? I felt that you challenged a number of underlying assumptions we have of God, and I think that was the most catalyst, paradigm-changing challenge that this book posed to me. Can you tell us a little bit more about the hidden nuances of the Trinity, but also of Christ that you bear out in the book?
Yeah, I think we've sort of started to touch on some of that already. And one of the things that there is in the book is a profound sense of kind of movement. So we've spoken already about story and about locating ourselves, but locating ourselves not in a static way, but in a way that acknowledges movement. And for me, we're saying something inherently Trinitarian there about the movement that exists within God. There's some really important stuff, I think, about who we say Jesus is, in the sense of what kind of power we are describing Jesus as having, and the kind of the mutuality of that power rather than as the hierarchical power. And that's why we include so many stories of Jesus being interrupted and being open to interruption. It's one of the ways of expressing that. But I think there's a lot in there that we knew and were deliberately writing about who God is for us and who Jesus is for us. But there's also stuff, I think, that we may not have been aware that other people are then picking up and reflecting back to us, which is a fascinating exercise.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think there's still many yes ands to be said from this point in the conversation onwards, has been around the pneumatology that in a sense kind of bubbles up and emerges in the cracks of what we've written. And to be absolutely honest about one bit of the writing process, towards the end of the process, I batted back a couple of chapters to Ruth and said, I think it feels like the Spirit is present throughout this stuff, but we need to name the kinds of forms of presence and activity of the Spirit more explicitly. And Ruth did an amazing job of kind of sort of spotting some of those cracks and weaving in just little kind of fragments of pneumatology along the way. And I guess, again, just as we want to say that ecclesiology and missiology are inextricable in our work, I think, the tendency of the church so often to kind of say, we are the body of Christ. I think we're wanting to kind of say yes and to that in terms of where are the fuzzy edges of the body of Christ in all of this, where actually that body is formed as much by those encounters as by what feels like it's in the center of the body. Where is the Spirit at work in the wider world that might be stretching or challenging or poking at the body of Christ itself? And I think, we've not done that in any kind of systematic Trinitarian way, but I think there are all kinds of threads that could be picked up on by people who wanted to.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull away at another thread, especially drawing from some of the conversations that was really interesting when we were planning this session. So bear with me, but can I take you back? I know you talked about this a little earlier, but I want to draw something out that you said earlier. You often, when you make an ecclesiological diagnosis in the book, you were sometimes telling us about how the nature of the church was a motif for the nature of God. Now you can correct me if that wasn't your intention at all. But as Tanner says, if you see incarnation as not as something that happens just at the point of incarnation, but one that continues to unfold from from thence on as the living body of Christ, that sort of cyclical, rejuvenating, decomposing body of the whole ecclesia you talk about. Were you aware that you were positing ecclesiology as theology or Christological pedagogy? I realize this is a sort of real curveball question, but tell us.
With 2 minutes to go, Sanjee, thank you.
4 minutes to go.
Shall I? Yeah, sure. I think we are, well, I am certainly really interested in this question about what does it mean for the church to be the body of Christ, and what therefore does the type of body that the church is tell us about Jesus, but also what does our reading of Jesus in Scripture tell us about what sort of body we might be called to be. And I think those are kind of interdependent questions. And this whole question about death and decomposition and all those sorts of things, I think that's really vital. I think understanding the body of Christ not as something sort of heroic and indestructible is really crucial, because Jesus nowhere gives us any indication that that's the kind of body he's interested in being or in us being. And acknowledging death as part of the process of resurrection and decomposition as part of the process of growth, which is a lesson we can learn from nature all around us. You need decomposition in order for there to be life. I think that kind of understanding of the interdependence that's going on there, as something which we should be modelling in church, rather than resisting with endless calls to growth and more growth and more growth without any decay. I think that is for us quite a big ecclesiological motif, I would say.
Well, you have less than a minute now.
Sorry.
Ruth said what needed saying, really. I think, as we said earlier, this is just a point in an ongoing conversation. And I think one of the things that we're wanting to say is that the interruptions that we describe and our openness to interruption that we seek to encourage and to practice is ultimately going to be revelatory of something new about God. That this is about encountering our neighbours, human and non-human, and in the process encountering God afresh.
What a wonderful place to stop. I apologize for those of you who have sent in. I can see lots of really interesting questions. I'm hoping Al and Ruth might respond to some of those questions on Twitter, especially those that have come up on Twitter. But let me finish, because we said we'd finish on time. Thanking our BSL interpreters, Gill and Rachel, but also Mike Higton and the Common Awards team for those who worked behind the scenes to bring this event to you. And a very, very big thank you to Al and Ruth for all you've brought to the table. So can we indicate our appreciation with applause, please?
Thank you.